This week on the Communicators, a discussion on what would happen to technology and telecom policy if Republicans win back the House of Representatives. Our guests are two former advisors to the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
Well, with control of Congress up for grabs in Tuesday's election, the Communicators is looking at potential leadership changes in Congress when it comes to telecommunications policy, as well as legislative proposals that the Democrats and the Republicans may take up in the 112th Congress when it comes to telecommunications. Joining us are two former Capitol Hill staffers who have both worked on telecommunications policy. Howard Waltzman worked with the Republicans, and he's the former Chief Telecommunications Counsel for the Energy and Commerce Committee. Greg Rothschild served in the same position for the Democrats. He also worked on the Senate side on telecommunications policy. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Both of our guests currently are lawyers who practice telecommunications law. Joining us also, Tony Rahm of the Politico as our guest reporter. Gentlemen, if I could start with a kind of a general question. Howard Waltzman, we'll start with you. If the Republicans take over Congress, the House, and or the Senate, what do you think are some of the legislative policies that they may pursue, and where will they concentrate their efforts when it comes to telecommunications?
Well, I think it'll be both a combination of legislative policies, but as well as oversight. I think that they'll be doing an inventory of what the FCC and NTIA have been doing, what proceedings are outstanding, and evaluating the direction that the Commission has been going, as well as NTIA proceedings on spectrum. Obviously, at the top of that list is the issue of broadband reclassification and net neutrality. So I would expect the Republicans to take a very hard look at where things stand with the Commission. Obviously, the Commission recently asked for additional comment on managed services and wireless. They'll be taking stock of where the Commission is and where the Commission intends to go. On the legislative side, you know, you could see a legislative reaction to what the Commission may do on broadband reclassification. I also expect a lot of activity on the spectrum front. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about there being a spectrum crunch and about the need for additional spectrum for commercial mobile services, as well as you know, a need for Congress to act to provide the FCC with the authority to have an incentive auction. So I expect the Republicans to be, you know, initiating that discussion at the beginning.
Greg Rothschild, if the Democrats control one of the chambers or both, and there's been talk about revamping the telecommunications laws, where do you see them going?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, hopefully, I obviously hope they do control, and that would leave Henry Waxman still as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. If he remains chairman, I would certainly expect him to continue his efforts to find some kind of compromise on broadband regulation. I think in a very honorable way, he took on the issue during the past year against some tough odds and got consensus among a lot of the stakeholders. The Republicans, for reasons that Howard can talk about, decided they didn't want to move forward at that time. But I think I think he did yeoman's work in reaching a compromise, and I think that he will be likely to push that forward. On the Senate side, Senator Rockefeller has been very clear that he considers spectrum to be a priority. He has a proposal to allocate the D block, which is a spectrum band that has long been sought by the public safety community to build a network. And I think that with support from the public safety community and support from certain carriers, he will look to move that early in the next Congress.
Tony Rahm.
Sure. I think no matter what happens next week, that there seems to be some consensus among stakeholders that there are going to be a lot of changes on the communications subcommittee in particular. There are a lot of members who seem to be vulnerable, others seem to be retiring, and then there is another crop that has aspirations elsewhere at some of the larger committees or in other subcommittees, even outside of the energy and commerce umbrella. So I guess the question is, you know, Boucher has operated under a rather bipartisan regime. He told us that he felt that the subcommittee was probably the least likely to be impacted by a change in the control of the House. So with the new crop of Republicans coming into the subcommittee, do you think that the subcommittee keeps its current bipartisan flair, or do you think that there's more antagonism between the two parties over some of the issues that both of you just identified, like net neutrality and broadband reclassification? Let's start with you.
Well, I think that subcommittee has had a tradition of bipartisanship going back, you know, more than a decade, back to the days when it was Jack Fields and Ed Markey, Billy Tozan and Ed Markey, and then Fred Upton and Ed Markey. And then, Ed Markey and Upton, then Stearns, and then Stearns and Boucher. I mean, it's always had a tradition of bipartisanship. When Greg and I were there together, we worked on a number of issues together. I mean, there's always been an impetus in that subcommittee to find common ground and to try to move forward in a bipartisan manner.
Sure, but do you think that this election in particular has been rather partisan, and I think the last couple weeks have been so as well? Do you see that changing at all with the new crop of GOP candidates coming in? Do you think that maybe the subcommittee could become particularly more polarized as some of these hot button issues become, the key things that the subcommittee is considering?
Well, the communications issues historically are not either sort of polarizing issues or really hot button issues. I mean, it's not the sort of polarizing type of issue that like healthcare is. So when you look at spectrum issues, when you look at broadband deployment, when you look at even privacy, I mean, none of these issues really break down in a partisan manner. I mean, there are different approaches, but there aren't sort of categorically different approaches like there are in other policy areas.
I just want to, I absolutely agree with Howard on that point. If you look historically back to the Tozan-Dingell bill, or all the bills that became the 1996 Telecommunications Act, they all had lead Democrat and Republican sponsors. And that committee, even after very partisan elections in '94 and 2000 and 2004, that committee still always worked in that subcommittee always worked in a bipartisan way. The one exception is broadband regulation. And on that one issue, which is net neutrality, which really came to the fore, I think back in 2006, it has largely broken down along partisan lines. And that is one issue where a Boucher and a Waxman at the committee and the subcommittee side, and then whoever is head of the Republican side of the committee and the subcommittee, I would expect them to take very different viewpoints.
Sure, and I think that gets us into the natural segue about net neutrality, which is making headlines everywhere. Just before lawmakers went on their break to begin campaigning for November, we saw the beginnings of a net neutrality compromise of sorts that was introduced by Waxman over at the full committee. It seemed that some Republicans could have supported it, but ultimately did not, whether it was because of the timeline, the fact the bill was introduced so quickly, or the fact that the election was coming up. There's no shortage of reasons on that alone. So I guess the question is, going forward, if the GOP does end up taking the House, does that compromise come back? Do they work in a bipartisan manner on that, or does the GOP never even broach the subject of that compromise?
I think one thing you need to recognize is the different approach and motivation for any type of broadband regulation legislation. On the Democrat side, I think it's that a lot of the Democrats, including the sort of leadership of the committee, believe that there is a threat to internet openness in the absence of at least FCC oversight, if not also congressional oversight. On the Republican side, they don't believe that there's a threat to internet openness. They see, a lack of problems happening out there, and they don't see a need for regulation or legislation. So the motivation for legislation at all, if it exists on the Republican side, is to stop the FCC from regulating broadband services under Title II as common carriage. So, I mean, that approach sort of colors the entire debate because, I mean, the motivation for doing it is going to be essentially based upon whether or not the FCC is going to move forward or there's a real threat that the FCC is going to move forward.
Sure, Greg. What does that leave Democrats with,
well,
I guess?
I think to pick up on Howard's point, I think I agree with what he said. I think a lot will depend on what the FCC does between the election and when Congress comes back in. And what I mean by that is if the FCC chairman goes ahead and has an order reclassifying Title II, then I would expect the Congress, frankly, Republican or Democrat, to work together to make sure that there's a legislative strategy in place to address broadband regulation as opposed to what the FCC did. Certainly, if the Republicans take over, you would see probably investigations and more oversight of that decision in addition to legislation.
Do you think that then forces the FCC to speed up or to slow down any movement on the reclassification or the net neutrality front if the GOP were to retake the House? And that's to both of you.
I think you can make an argument both ways on that. I think the chairman of the FCC has said he's deferring to a Congress, and he wants Congress to go ahead and act, which makes sense. The Telecommunications Act currently was written for a single-purpose network analog environment, and obviously that doesn't exist today. You have multi-purpose networks that are digital. So the chairman of the FCC is looking to address that after the recent court decision. If he does, then clearly we'll have we'll have reaction coming from the Congress. And one point I wanted to add to what Howard mentioned before is that one problem when you look at it from a Democrat-Republican side is that many Democrats don't support the FCC decision. You had roughly 25%, maybe even more, of the Democrats in the House write the FCC a letter saying don't go forward with this approach. And that would color what happens next year, whether or not the Democrats or Republicans are in charge.
You know, I think the question in terms of does the FCC wait for legislation, you know, legislating is not an easy thing. It's not a quick process. And, you know, Greg and I could go on for a long time about how the Communications Act is outdated and needs to be updated, including and especially with respect to the internet space. So, you know, is the FCC going to wait until January or February for Congress to act, or is the FCC going to be patient and wait for Congress to really create an appropriate framework for internet services? You know, I don't think if it's just a question of, well, the FCC will wait if Congress is going to enact legislation, achieve consensus in both houses, you know, by, you know, sort of January or February. There are obviously a lot of the public interest groups are pushing the FCC to act as quickly as possible. I don't think Republicans feel a need for the haste of legislation because, again, they don't see a threat to the internet out there.
Do you then see immediately, you know, once Republicans begin to take over the subcommittee, we've dealt with who might be leading it and things of that sort, that the Republicans look for ways to maybe constrain the FCC or to redefine its role in the broadband space?
Well, again, I mean, to redefine the FCC's
in a more
role,
limited role, I suppose.
Well, I mean, to redefine it would have to be legislatively. I mean, I do see them immediately engaging in oversight and really evaluating where's the FCC, what has the FCC done, what is the FCC planning on doing, and then putting together an action plan from there. You know, if there's immediate need for action, you know, I would expect the Republicans to act. But, you know, if there's not an immediate need for action, they're probably going to take more time and address this issue in a deliberate fashion.
Gentlemen, if the broadband issue is, you know, opposed by 25% of Democrats, is this a philosophical issue? Is this a geographical issue? How does this one break down?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, part of it I think is philosophical. Part of it is what is the extent to which the FCC should be involved in sort of internet network management? Should prioritization be possible? I mean, what are the sort of expectations with respect to internet applications? But a lot of it also comes down to deployment. And I think that's a regional issue because I think a lot of members are more concerned with, you know, what's the extent of deployment in my district or state? What are the speeds? What's the network sophistication? And they're more concerned about getting investment out there to have the best services possible. They're more concerned about that. I think what you saw with every House Republican, and as Greg said, you know, 25% of the House Democrats saying, wait, FCC, this is your third way is the wrong approach. I mean, it's because they're more concerned with getting the best broadband services to their customers and making sure that the private sector deployment and investment supports that than they are about a potential threat in the future to internet openness.
And I think to add to that, I think what Howard is referring to is this notion that members want to see the FCC help them get broadband to their districts. They view, I think particularly today when jobs is such an important issue, they want the FCC to help them get broadband, get deployment, get jobs, get economic growth in their districts. And they believe that when Julius Genachowski, the FCC chairman, was talking about the National Broadband Plan, that was a good step in that direction. He was talking about making more spectrum available for wireless. He was talking about reforming universal service to get broadband deeper into certain parts of America that don't have it today. And a lot of, I think, Democrats and Republicans potentially look at the FCC's recent preoccupation with net neutrality and say, wait a second, that's not what we want you to do. We want you to focus on broadband. And I think a lot of the Democrats, in opposing the FCC's reclassification proposal, were sending them a message, we want you to get back to basics.
Greg Rothschild, what is the relationship between the telecommunications committees and the FCC? Is there a lead?
There's always been a lot of communication, I think, going on between the chairman of the committee and the chairman of the subcommittees in both the House and the Senate and the FCC. The FCC is a creature of the Congress, was created by the Congress, and certainly the chairman of the committees, and when I worked for John Dingell, who was the ranking member, he viewed it he viewed it similarly, that the folks on the FCC really should be paying attention to the committee. And I think the people who hold the gavel and the people that sit next to them in the minority both expect the FCC to be responsive to the wishes of the Congress.
Mr. Waltzman?
You know, I always felt when I was on committee staff, as well as when I worked for Senator Brownback on Senate Commerce, that there was a good dialogue with the FCC. The FCC was always open, both the commissioners as well as the bureaus, in terms of coming up and doing briefings. You know, I mean, in both Republican and Democrat-led commissions, sometimes we liked what they were doing, sometimes we didn't like what they were doing. But, you know, I always felt like there was a good, healthy dialogue, and that the FCC always made themselves accessible to Hill staff.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. We're talking about the upcoming Tuesday midterm election with Howard Waltzman, former Chief Telecommunications Counsel for the Energy and Commerce Committee when the Republicans were in charge, and Greg Rothschild, who was the Chief Telecommunications Counsel when the Democrats were in charge. Tony Rahm, Politico, next topic area.
Thanks. So I think you know, as we just said, there's been this huge preoccupation with net neutrality, in some cases to the detriment of members who would like to see the FCC talking about things in the National Broadband Plan. So let's start talking about some of those items. I mean, one of the things that the FCC wanted was some kind of Connect America fund, a fund that would help, you know, build out broadband to some of the hard to reach areas. But there was a poll that came out not long ago by the Pew Center that said a lot of Americans actually didn't want the FCC to play that much of a role in expanding broadband by itself. Now, some stakeholders had said that, you know, maybe there was some misunderstanding of the question, or maybe it was just, you know, when voters hear government and broadband expansion, they think, you know, government controlling the internet or something like that. But I guess the question is, in a GOP-controlled Congress, what role does the FCC play in expanding broadband? Does it take the lead? Does it wait for Congress? What relationship develops there? Let's start with you, Howard.
Well, again, you know, I think one of the primary focuses in the next Congress will be on spectrum, getting more spectrum out there, and spectrum being a means to increase broadband, both deployment and subscribership in the United States. So the FCC can only go so far right now. I mean, there are certain bands which they could make available for commercial use, but there are a lot of other bands they'd like to make available for commercial use that they need congressional action before they can do so. So I really see that as being a focal point, as, you know, I mean, FCC, you know, sort of talking to Congress and there being a dialogue back and forth, but Congress acting to ensure that more spectrum can be made available.
Do you foresee the Republicans being supportive of Senator Rockefeller's proposal? And what about Julius Genachowski's use of the white spaces proposal?
Well, I mean, I think Republicans have come down in different places on the white spaces proposal, and they've come down in different places on Senator Rockefeller's proposal. You know, certainly, and again, another example of sort of the bipartisanship on communications issues is, you know, Waxman and Barton had a bipartisan proposal for how to deal with the D block. It was different than the Rockefeller proposal. So, you know, I don't know that it will necessarily be embraced in the House on either side.
Sure. I guess just to follow up on that, you know, on the D block in particular, which is what we're essentially talking about, that small chunk of spectrum that could be given either directly to public safety for them to build out, or to be given to commercial carriers, which would then do some of the work in building it out and leasing the spectrum off. I mean, how do you see that resolving itself, Greg? Do you see Republicans, you know, taking the tack that Rockefeller did, or kind of, you know, working on something similar to what Waxman has, given the support that it's already gotten?
Well, you know, so far this issue is breaking down by House, not by party. And it'll be interesting to see how that resolves itself. Right now, it appears that Senator Rockefeller has taken the initiative in the Senate, and the ball seems to be in his court. I think if I would expect him to move earlier on that issue, and to set the agenda and the terms of the debate. Shortly after the hearing, I believe the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Hutchison from Texas, said positive things about the Rockefeller proposal, which indicates you might see a bipartisan bill coming out of the Senate Commerce Committee, which gives the D block to public safety and then supports building the public safety network through auctions.
Sure. Are incentive auctions that one component of the Rockefeller bill that would, you know, voluntarily take spectrum that broadcasters give up, you know, and auction it back off for wireless use? Is that one of those items that just seems to be universally supported? I really haven't heard anybody actually on either side saying incentive auctions are a bad thing. So do you think that's one of the things that wins the day no matter what happens?
I think the concept.
No, I'm sorry.
I was going to say that I think the concept is, I mean, there are a lot of details you have to work out in terms of, how much money do the existing, do the existing licensees just get compensated to cease business? Do they get compensated to be relocated to a different band? I mean, so there are lots of issues involved in how you do the mechanics. But I think in general, using auction proceeds, I mean, look, the spectrum below 3 gigahertz is ideal for commercial mobile services. The spectrum below 1 gigahertz is even better because you've got better propagation characteristics. You have to build fewer towers. So there's a lot of interest in making more spectrum below 1 gigahertz available for commercial mobile use. If you're going to have to displace existing licensees, there's some sort of wrenching decisions that have to be made about how you compensate them and whether they're going to be in business in a different band. And so I don't think it's clear at all where members will come down on any of those sorts of issues, but I think that there's a real impetus to address that issue.
Mr. Roth.
I was just going to say that you always have to start with the premise that nothing in this policy arena is ever universally supported. So the notion of incentive auctions at a very top line has the support certainly of the broadcast community and appears to have the support of the wireless community. But there are a lot of questions, and Howard, I think, raised some of the most important ones, where you could quickly see fissures start to develop between the parties or among the industries very, very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see how that debate plays out.
Mr. Rothschild, the issue of privacy, online privacy, has gotten a lot of press attention in the last 6 months or so. How do you see that playing out in the 112?
That's always the wild card in this issue area. I would just observe that I think since 1999, and Howard, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, in every Congress, when it's begun, the chairman of one of the committees of jurisdiction has said, this is the year we're going to pass privacy legislation. And each year we spend time on it, bills are introduced, and what typically folks recognize as they get deeper into the debate is this is a very complicated ecosystem. There's ad networks, there's publishers, there's content providers, there's internet service providers, and what's grown up is this ecosystem where consumers benefit from a lot of internet content that's made available for free. And the reason that is it's supported by advertising, and that advertising is becoming more valuable and able to support richer content because of the targeted nature of that advertising. But it's also how that advertising becomes targeted, which is where consumers sometimes object. And that's where the rub is. But when members of Congress start to delve in and start to write rules, they realize quickly that they are going to affect that internet ecosystem, and they're going to affect the consumer's experience in ways that consumers may not like. And that issue, I think, how that issue gets resolved, and if it's able to be resolved, will determine whether or not we have legislation in the next Congress.
But the noise, Mr. Waltzman, around privacy has really ramped up in the last 6 months or so. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the problem is as people do more and more online, not just communicate, but participate in social networks, purchase products. As more and more of your information is sort of there online, it's more valuable to advertisers, and that for better or worse is the engine that drives the internet ecosystem. It's most websites are free, and they're free because, as Greg said, they're advertisement driven. And so the tug of war between people wanting to protect and keep confidential a lot of that information about what they're doing online versus sustaining the economic model that the internet, it's a very tough dilemma. But I absolutely agree with you that the noise, and it's every day. I mean, every day there's the Wall Street Journal series is a good example, and there are other examples. There is a lot of noise about customer, not even just customer, just even people participating on social networks, having their information, including personally identifiable information, being passed on to third parties and sold to advertisers.
So I guess the next question is, you said it's a tough dilemma figuring out that right balance. Does that lead the subcommittee or the full committee to take more of a wait-and-see approach, entering the 112th Congress, seeing what the FTC and the Department of Commerce do before it begins to move on some of the legislative legwork? Or does it take a more proactive role, starting right when the 112th picks off, right where the 111 left off with the bill that Boucher and Stearns and Rush and the many other members who have their hands in that pot have long been working on? And that's for both of you.
Well, I mean, think certainly the issue will have a high profile in the next Congress, and I think there'll certainly be hearings, and members will begin to sort of debate what the best, and be educated from witnesses on, what the best approach is. I don't know that they'll necessarily begin with where the current legislative drafts are, but I certainly think the issue is going to continue to be important, and there's going to continue to be focus on if there's going to be a federal comprehensive framework in the online space, what should that framework be?
We just saw the White House put together an interagency task force on this issue. We expect the chairman of the FTC to release his report very, very soon. That'll influence the debate. You've had the private sector come together with a self-regulatory set of guidelines and policies which were just recently implemented. So I think Congress will get together in January and they'll look at all that. There will certainly be hearings. I think we know for certain there'll be legislation introduced. The question will always be, when that legislation starts to move, do the members feel comfortable voting on that, and do they really feel comfortable, they understand the ramifications of it? The most difficult thing, oftentimes the most difficult reason it's difficult to move a telecommunications bill is members like to vote on things that they feel really comfortable with the substance. And on the issue of privacy, because of the intricacies, again, of the internet ecosystem, I think it'll take a little while to get members ready to move that type of legislation.
Gentlemen, the Verizons, AT&T, Comcast, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Intel, Cisco, just to name a few very large American companies. Who do they want to be in charge, the Republicans or the Democrats?
I think you'd have to ask them.
I would agree with Howard. I'd rather you ask them.
Next question.
I guess that does kind of get us into a little bit of talk about what's happening with the subcommittee and full committee leadership. Do you see there being a drastic change? I mean, we've heard a number of candidates, from Shimkus to Upton, if the full committee doesn't work out, to Stearns maybe leaving to go to Veterans Affairs, and to any other host of names, including Walden, who was once on the committee and gave up his spot. Do you think that those candidates, I mean, I know you can't speak to the individuals as you just said, but do you think that those candidates represent different, very, very strikingly different views on some of the issues that we talked about? Or do you see them all kind of being in a similar camp, so much so that it's kind of safe to say that no matter which one of them does take up the subcommittee, that we're going to see a slightly different role for the subcommittee, like, as you said, policing the FCC, looking at an oversight role, taking more of a backseat on that neutrality?
And just to further Tony's question, does it matter if Fred Upton is chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, or Joe Barton, or Cliff Stearns?
Well, I think that they all are going to be focused on broadband reclassification and spectrum. And, again, given the noise on privacy, it's tough not to see how they'd be focused on privacy. I mean, I think those are going to be the committee priorities. Frankly, I think they're the committee priorities whether the Republicans are charged or whether the Democrats are charged. So I think it also certainly is, regardless of who's in charge of that committee, those are the sort of hot button issues. Those are likely to be the priorities moving forward.
Sure. And just to follow up on that really quickly, what should we expect to see, if Upton, who is widely believed to be, in the front riding for the full committee, what should we expect to see on that front in terms of a telecom law rewrite? What kinds of things do you think an Upton-led full committee might look to?
Well, I mean, he's been already talked about. I think he had an op-ed recently in the Washington Times talking about concern about regulation and engaging in oversight. So I think we'll see a lot of oversight, both of the FCC, of the BTOP program, of everything sort of within that jurisdiction. But Upton and Barton participated in the sort of the last attempt at a comprehensive rewrite, which was in '96, and Dingell and Markey participated in that as well. So I mean, he's gotten his feet wet with respect to a broad rewrite of the Communications Act. And so, but that, again, that's not an easy task. It's not a quick task. But I mean, that is something that he does have familiarity with.
And Greg Rothschild, if Mr. Waxman maintains or retains his chairmanship, where do you see his focus?
Well, again, I think that
particularly when it comes to the rewriting of the Telecom.
Sure. He, as you both know, he spent the past few months of the last Congress, that we are actually the present Congress, attempting to gain some kind of consensus around the issue of broadband regulation. I would think that assuming he maintains the chairmanship, he'll try to continue those negotiations, work with the Republicans on the committee, work with the industry, work with folks in the Democrat and Republican Party to achieve that consensus, to pass something to give the FCC clear direction on broadband regulation. And on the Senate side, Senator Rockefeller obviously has been following that issue very closely and was involved in stakeholder meetings on the subject, but he seems more targeted in focusing on the spectrum question, particularly on allocating spectrum to public safety to get a public safety network built as quickly as possible and using funding from auctions to support the building of that network.
And we have to leave it there. Thank you both, former lead counsels for the Telecommunications Committee. Howard Waltzman, Republican, and Greg Rothschild, Democrat. Tony Rahm, Politico. Thank you all for being on the Communicators.
Thank you.
Thank you.